The scent of slow decay was a perfume to Dr. Ilara Vance. It was the fragrance of forgotten glue, of paper surrendering to time, of leather bindings exhaling the breath of centuries. In the deep quiet of the university archives, long after the last student had hurried home through the autumn chill, she found her true element. The cavernous room was a cathedral of silence, its high windows black mirrors reflecting the pool of warm light from her solitary desk lamp. Around her, the shelves stood like sentinels, holding their weight of stories in the dark. Her work was a tapestry of echoes. Spread before her were photocopies, translations, and her own meticulous notes, a constellation of flood narratives drawn from the farthest corners of human memory. Her specialty was comparative mythology, a discipline that felt less like a science and more like listening to a vast whispering choir where each voice sang a similar, haunting refrain in a different tongue. Tonight, the chorus was singing of water. Her finger traced a line of translated cuneiform, the angular script a stark contrast to the fluid cursive of her own handwriting in the margins. It was from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Mesopotamian saga etched into clay millennia ago. The hero Gilgamesh, in his quest for immortality, seeks out the ancient sage Utnapishtim, the one man who survived the gods' great deluge. The description was visceral, a storm so terrible it terrified even the gods. A blackened land, a boat lodged upon a mountain. Ilara leaned back, her chair giving a soft sigh that echoed in the stillness. She turned a page, her eyes moving to another text. This was a translation of a fragment from the Eridu Genesis Sumerian, even older. Here, the flood hero was Ziusudra, warned by a compassionate god to build a great vessel. The details differed, the names of the gods, the dimensions of the boat, the specific duration of the rain, but the architecture of the story was identical. A divine decision to cleanse the world, a chosen survivor warned in secret, a massive life-preserving ark, a catastrophic flood covering the earth, a bird sent forth to find land, a sacrifice of gratitude upon a mountaintop. A shiver, not of cold but of profound recognition, travelled down her spine. She reached for a third folder, this one containing notes on the flood narrative from the Matsya Purana, of ancient India. Here, the first avatar of Vishnu, a great fish, warned the sage Manu of the coming deluge. Again, the warning. Again, the boat built to preserve the seeds of all life. Again, the waters rising to submerge the world. Ilara stood, needing to move, to feel the solidity of the present moment against the vertigo of deep time. She walked slowly between the towering shelves, her fingertips brushing the spines of countless volumes. The paradox was not new to her, it was the very foundation of her life's work, but in the intimate silence of the archive, it ceased to be an academic puzzle and became something more personal, a gentle, persistent mystery breathing in the dust-laden air. How could cultures separated by continents and oceans, by language and belief, by millennia, dream the same dream? Was it the ghost of a single cataclysmic event, a trauma so vast it scarred the collective memory of humanity's earliest storytellers? Or was it something woven into the very fabric of the human experience, the universal terror of the river that nourishes your field suddenly rising to swallow your home, the psychological archetype of cleansing and rebirth, a story born independently, wherever people lived at the mercy of water and sky? She returned to her desk, the lamplight carving her face out of the darkness. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, a gentle patter against the high windows. It was a modern rain, predictable, measured by meteorologists. Yet, listening to it, she could almost hear the echo of an older, fiercer downpour, one that lasted for 40 days in one tradition, 7 in another, or for years in a third. The rain connected her to all of them. It was the same water after all, cycling eternally from sea to cloud to land. She opened a fresh notebook, its pages blank and promising. At the top she wrote a single question: what are the waters trying to tell us? It was not a question she expected to answer definitively. It was a compass point, a reason to journey. The flood paradox was not a locked door to be broken down, but a labyrinthine garden to be wandered, its paths leading through archaeology, geology, theology, and the fragile, enduring medium of story. Her contemplation was a form of reverence. In these whispering archives, amid the records of humanity's oldest fears and hopes, Elara Vance felt the first stirrings of a pilgrimage, not to a place, but through the shared memory of a world born from, and nearly returned to, the all-consuming sea. The quiet puzzle beckoned, its pieces scattered across time and stone, waiting for a patient hand to trace their connections in the soft golden light. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 2. The First Rains. Part 1. Asterisk. The rain over the Anatolian plateau was a soft, persistent whisper, a veil of grey that blurred the line between the vast empty sky and the ochre earth. For Dr. Elara Vance, stepping from the dry confines of the Konya airport into this damp embrace felt like crossing a threshold into a different kind of archive. Here, the records were not inscribed on clay or parchment, but in the very soil, in the silent bones of a place called Çatalhöyük. The taxi ride was a journey through a monochrome dream, fields stretching away under the low sky, the only colour the occasional flash of a red poppy clinging stubbornly to a ditch. The settlement revealed itself not as a city in any conventional sense, but as a low, sprawling mound rising gently from the flat plain like the back of a sleeping beast. There were no grand walls, no obvious streets. Instead, the excavated area presented a honeycomb of rectangular outlines, the ghostly footprints of mud brick houses built side by side, entered through holes in their roofs. It was a community turned inward, a Neolithic hive. Elara pulled her coat tighter against the drizzle and walked slowly along the wooden boardwalk laid over the site, her boots making soft, hollow thumps that were swallowed by the rain. This was one of humanity's first great experiments in settled life, a place where people ceased wandering and began to build, to store grain, to paint bulls on their walls, and to bury their dead beneath plaster floors, and, as Elara had come to see, a place where they first began a deliberate, fragile dance with water. She paused, looking down into one of the excavated dwellings. The archaeologists had left a section of the wall exposed, showing the layers of plaster, each a testament to seasonal renewal. In one corner, a shallow plastered basin was visible, a simple, crucial technology. Rainwater catchment, the first intentional sip from the sky's bounty, a means of taming the sporadic rains for daily use. Her guide was a local researcher, a quiet woman named Aylin, whose eyes held the same patient intensity as the landscape. She met Elara by a sheltered interpretation area, where a tarpaulin drummed a gentle rhythm overhead. Aylin spoke not with the flourish of a tour guide, but with the careful precision of someone who listens to the earth. She pointed to a stratigraphic diagram pinned to a board, its layers a history book written in sediment. "The story here is one of mud," Aylin said, her finger tracing a line across the diagram. "Most of the layers, they tell of daily life. Ash from hearths, plaster from walls, refuse. But here," her finger stopped on a thick dark band near the diagram's center. "This is different. This is not a gentle accumulation. This is a single event. A catastrophic mud layer." Elara leaned closer, the cool, damp air sharp in her nostrils. The layer was startling in its thickness, a violent interruption in the orderly sequence of domestic dust. Aylin explained how the analysis showed it was not a gradual floodplain deposit, but a sudden massive slurry, a debris flow of water-saturated earth that had likely surged from the nearby hills, triggered by an extreme, prolonged deluge. It had buried parts of the settlement in an instant, sealing rooms and their contents in a thick, wet shroud. "It would have been terrifying," Aylin murmured, her gaze drifting over the excavated pits now filling with puddles of rainwater. One moment, life as normal. The next, a wall of mud and water roaring down. Some houses were filled to the roof. People would have fled, or been trapped. The survivors would have dug, pulling belongings and perhaps bodies from the muck. Elara walked back to the boardwalk's edge, looking out over the mound. The gentle rain falling on the site now seemed a pathetic echo of that ancient cataclysm. She tried to envision it, the sound, a deep rumble growing to a roar, the sight of a brown tide swallowing the familiar landscape, the desperate scramble up ladders onto rooftops, the choking, cold embrace of the sludge, the sheer overwhelming power of a world dissolving into liquid earth. And then, the aftermath, the stunned silence under a clearing sky, the mud settling into a new grim topography, the digging, the loss, the profound, existential shock for a community whose entire worldview was rooted in the stability of their houses, their stored food, their plastered walls. How would such an event etch itself into memory? It would not be a mere historical footnote. For a people with no written language, such a trauma would demand story. It would require explanation, meaning, a place in the cosmic order. Perhaps it became a tale of divine displeasure, a cleansing of some spiritual impurity, or a story of a warning given and heeded by a lucky few. The practical details, the sudden mudslide, the houses buried, would over generations distill into archetypal images. The overwhelming waters, the preserved vessel, the solitary mountain, the first-hand local horror of Çatalhöyük's mud layer could, through the alembic of oral tradition and migration, transform into the foundational myth of a great flood. Aylin joined her, following her gaze. "We find no giant boat here," Aylin said, a faint wry smile touching her lips. "Only mud brick walls. But the fear is the same, the memory of the ground becoming liquid, of the sky falling down in torrents. That is the seed." Elara nodded, the quiet punctuated by the rain's patter. The paradox in the archives now had a texture, a smell of wet clay and ancient panic. This peaceful, rain-soaked mound was a cradle, not just of agriculture and art, but perhaps of one of humanity's oldest and most universal nightmares, a story born from the very earth liquefying beneath the feet of the first builders. The first rains here were not just life-giving, they were the architects of a memory so powerful it would echo for millennia, waiting for a patient listener to hear its soft, persistent whisper in the drizzle. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 2, The First Rains, Part 2, asterisk, asterisk. The modern river was a placid silver ribbon under the late afternoon sun, a world away from the churning, mud-choked cataclysm of ancient Çatalhöyük. Elara sat on a smooth, water-worn stone on its bank, her notebook open but untouched on her lap. The journey from the Anatolian plateau to this gentle European watercourse had been a transition from the source of the story to one of its countless diluted echoes. Here, the river murmured rather than roared, a soothing background hum to her contemplation. She watched the current, its surface dappled with light, carrying leaves and twigs on an endless journey to the sea. Water, she reflected, was the ultimate paradox in the human experience, the definitive life-giver and the most indiscriminate destroyer. For the first agrarian societies, this duality was not philosophical. It was the brutal rhythm of existence. Their entire world, their hard-won security born from domesticated seeds and stored harvests, was tethered to the mercy of rainfall and river. A season of gentle, nourishing rains meant prosperity, children's laughter, and the leisure to paint spirits on plaster walls. But the same sky could, without warning, transform into a vengeful ocean. The psychological impact of a catastrophic flood on such communities would be seismic. It was more than the loss of homes or granaries. It was a violation of a nascent covenant with nature. The very element that promised life had revealed a capacity for absolute erasure. The ground, the symbol of stability and fertility, could become a liquid grave in hours. Such an event would shatter the perceived order of the world, creating a psychic wound that demanded the balm of narrative. The story would be a mechanism for processing the trauma, for imposing meaning on chaos. It would transform a random natural disaster into an event with moral or divine causation, a punishment, a cleansing, a necessary reset. The flood myth, in this light, was not merely a record of a past event, but a therapeutic tool, a way for a collective psyche to digest the indigestible. It allowed a people to move from helpless victimhood to a place of chosen survival. By casting a few as righteous and warned, the story preserved a sense of agency. By ending with a covenant or a new beginning, it offered hope, a promise that such total annihilation would not come again without reason. The Ark or the high mountain was not just a physical refuge, it was a psychological life raft for the culture's continuity. A fish broke the river's surface with a soft plop, sending concentric rings expanding until they dissolved into the flow. The ripples reminded Elara of a story from a different ancient world, one shaped by desert and dreamtime. In her mind, she summoned the Aboriginal Australian narrative of the rainbow serpent and the Great Flood. It was a tale not of divine wrath, but of profound creative power and the cleansing of memory. The rainbow serpent, a being of immense age and energy, slept beneath the flat, featureless earth. Upon awakening, it pushed upward, its massive body carving out the rivers, valleys and mountains as it moved across the land. Where it rested, it left waterholes, the sources of life. But the serpent was also a figure of law and balance. In the version Elara recalled, the people grew disrespectful, neglecting the ancient ceremonies and laws laid down in the dreaming. In response, the rainbow serpent stirred in its watery depths, causing the skies to darken and the rains to fall. Not for days, but for a timeless epoch. The waters rose from the earth and descended from the heavens, merging to cover the entire world, purging it of the forgetful ones. This was not a punishment in a moralistic sense, but a necessary restoration of order. The flood was a return to the primordial watery state from which the serpent had first shaped the world. It was a reset button for reality itself, washing away the spiritual stagnation to allow for a new beginning. 2 survivors, often a man and a woman, were said to have been saved on a high piece of land, or sometimes within the shelter of the serpent itself. When the waters receded, the world was new again, glistening and fresh, its contours redefined by the serpent's renewed passage. The rainbow serpent arched its colourful body across the sky, becoming a permanent promise and a reminder of its creative destructive power. The flood here was inseparable from creation, destruction and rebirth were 2 movements of the same eternal song. It served as a cleansing of memory, washing away the accumulated errors of the people, so that the original, sacred laws of the dreaming could be remembered and followed anew. Sitting by the calm river, Elara saw the connection. Whether framed as a moral reckoning in Mesopotamia or a cyclical cleansing in Australia, the flood story served a core human need: to make the unbearable comprehensible, to find a pattern in the chaos. The water that gave life to the first barley fields in Anatolia was the same elemental force that, in excess, could erase them. That capacity for both creation and destruction resided in every river, every cloud, every ocean. The deep-seated human connection to water was therefore ambivalent, a relationship of profound gratitude and primal fear. The myths were the negotiation of that relationship, attempts to appease, to understand, to memorialize and to warn. The sun dipped lower, casting long, trembling reflections on the water. The river's gentle persistence was a testament to its ultimate power. It did not need to rage to be sovereign. Its constant flow shaped continents over millennia. The great floods of myth were perhaps the moments when that slow, patient power expressed itself in a sudden, violent crescendo, shocking humanity into storytelling. Elara closed her notebook, the story of the rainbow serpent lingering in her thoughts. It was a tale that refused to separate the destroyer from the creator, seeing the deluge as a painful but necessary return to the source, a baptism for the world itself. The first rains, wherever they fell, were never just weather. They were the opening notes in an epic of memory, where water was both the pen writing the story and the ink that could, at any moment, blot the entire page clean, leaving only the faint rainbow promise of a fresh start. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 3. The Clay Tablets of Shuruppak. Asterisk. The museum's Near Eastern gallery was a sanctuary of hushed, filtered light. Here, the clamour of the city outside dissolved into a profound stillness, broken only by the occasional muffled footfall of a guard or the soft, reverent sigh of the climate control system. Dr. Elara Vance stood before a display case, her reflection a ghostly overlay on the glass, her gaze fixed on the objects within. They were not gold or lapis lazuli, but humble, unglazed clay, the colour of dried earth, Sumerian cuneiform tablets from Shuruppak, one of the world's oldest cities. To the untrained eye, they were little more than small, broken bricks, pocked with precise, wedge-shaped indentations. To Elara, they were windows into a primordial dawn, the very cradle of the story that had drawn her across continents. She had obtained special permission for a closer examination, and a curator, a man with meticulous hands and a voice softer than the gallery's ambience, had laid one of the less fragile fragments on a foam-lined tray in a side room. Now, alone with it, under the cool beam of an angled lamp, Ilara felt a tremor of connection that was almost physical. She did not touch the tablet. Its 3,000-year-old fragility forbade that, but she leaned close, her breath stilled. The clay was not smooth. It bore the faint granular texture of the riverbank silt from which it had been formed. The edges were worn, softened by time, but the inscribed faces held their sharp, deliberate patterns. Each triangular and linear impression was made by the corner of a stylus of reed or wood, pressed into the moist clay before firing. This was not writing as abstraction, it was a tangible recording, a thought made permanent through physical pressure. The fragment was from what scholars called the asterisk Eridu-Genesis, asterisk, or the asterisk Sumerian flood story asterisk. The text was incomplete, a puzzle of phrases, but the key elements were there. She read from her own translation notes, her eyes flicking between the modern paper and the ancient script. The gods, the asterisk Anunnaki asterisk, had decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Their reasons were shrouded in the broken lines, but the decision was collective and grim. Yet one god, Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, chose to subvert the decree. He did not appear to the flood hero, Ziusudra, in a dream or a vision. In this oldest version, he spoke to him through a wall of reed, a whisper through a screen. A secret passed through the very architecture of a house to avoid the ears of the other deities. The intimacy of the warning struck Ilara. It was a conspiratorial act, a breach of divine unanimity for the sake of a single righteous man. Ziusudra, the finder of life, was instructed to build a great boat, a circular coracle-like vessel, according to some interpretations, and to bring aboard the seed of all living things. The tablet described the storm in stark, terrifying terms: a wind that roared, darkness so profound it blotted out the sun, a tempest that raged for 7 days and 7 nights. When it ceased, Ziusudra opened a window and released birds, a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven to find evidence of land. The raven did not return, signaling the recession of the waters. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and Ziusudra made a sacrifice to the gods, who gathered around the sweet savour like flies. Ilara sat back, removing her reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. The tactile reality of the clay anchored the myth, giving it a weight far beyond the later, more polished epics. This was not yet grand literature. It was a record, almost a report, its rhythm dictated by the need to conserve space on the precious tablet. The hero was not a king like Gilgamesh, seeking immortality, but a pious man, a governor of Shuruppak, who was granted eternal life in the distant paradise of Dilmun as a reward for his preservation of life. The focus was on the mechanics of survival and the restoration of divine favour. Her mind then turned to the later, Babylonian versions, particularly the flood story embedded within the asterisk epic of Gilgamesh. Asterisk. There, the survivor was Utnapishtim, the faraway, and the narrative was woven into a larger, more philosophical quest. The details had shifted, evolved through centuries of retelling. The warning from the god Ea, the Babylonian counterpart to Enki, became more elaborate, delivered in a clever riddle about building a boat so large it would annoy the other gods. The storm lasted 6 days and 7 nights, and the boat was a massive cubical ark, a detailed feat of engineering. The birds were sent out again, but the sequence and their symbolism felt more refined, more literary. Utnapishtim and his wife were granted immortality, not as a reward in a distant land, but where they stood, becoming like gods themselves. The core, however, remained unshakable. A collective divine decision to send a cleansing flood, a secret warning to a chosen individual, the construction of a life-preserving vessel, the catastrophic world-covering deluge, the grounding on a mountain, the birds sent as scouts, the sacrifice of gratitude, the promise of a new beginning. The names changed, the motivations were nuanced, the dimensions of the boat altered, but the skeleton of the story was identical. It was as if the Sumerian clay tablet provided the raw foundational mould, and the Babylonian scribes, with their greater literary ambition, had cast a more elaborate and dramatic statue from the same essential material. Ilara looked again at the fragment on the tray. The cuneiform signs for flood and boat were simple, repeated wedges. In their very simplicity, they felt more potent. This was a story born in the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, where life was literally a gift of the twin rivers, and death could arrive on their floodwaters with terrifying speed. The account of Ziusudra was not a metaphor, it was a direct translation of that environmental reality into the cosmic order. The gods who controlled the waters could both give and take away. Survival depended on divine grace, received through cryptic channels, and on the frantic, obedient labour of building something that could float. The quiet of the room deepened. The clay tablet seemed to hum with a low, persistent frequency, the resonance of a story that had refused to die. It had travelled from Shuruppak to Babylon, its details shifting like silt in a current, adapting to new kings, new gods, new literary tastes. Yet its heart, the memory of water rising to the rooftops, the desperate hope of a sealed vessel, the profound loneliness, and then the relief of a mountaintop emerging from a universal sea, that heart beat as strongly in the Babylonian epic as it did in this broken piece of fired earth. Ilara felt she was not just comparing texts, but witnessing the germination of a meme, a cultural gene of astonishing durability. The paradox was here, in this very case. The story changed constantly, yet it never changed at all. It was as constant as the clay itself, shaped by countless hands across the centuries, but always, fundamentally, made of the same earth and water, bearing the same indelible impression of a fear and a hope, as old as civilization. Kana. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 4. The Boat Upon the Mountain. Asterisk. Asterisk. The lamplight in Ilara's study pooled like liquid amber, illuminating the open pages of the asterisk. Epic of Gilgamesh. Asterisk. She had returned from the museum with the granular feel of the Shuruppak clay still haunting her fingertips, a tactile memory that made the later, more polished Babylonian text feel vibrantly immediate. She was no longer just reading a translation, she was listening at a keyhole to an ancient terrified whisper that had grown into a resonant epic. This was the story of Utnapishtim, the faraway, the man who survived the god's wrath and was granted immortality. As her eyes moved across the lines, the quiet study dissolved, replaced by the sun-baked mud brick of the city of Shuruppak in a time before memory. She saw him not as a mythic archetype, but as a man, a wealthy, perplexed elder standing on his roof as the god Ea's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. The message had been a riddle, spoken to the reed walls of his house so the other gods would not hear. Asterisk. Abandon wealth, seek life, spurn possessions, keep thy soul alive, bring the seed of all living things into the ship. The command was terrifying in its vagueness and its scale. Build a boat upon dry land, in a city that knew only the gentle irrigation canals and the distant life-giving rivers. His neighbours would think him mad. Yet, a divine tremor in the air, a pressure in the dream-haunted silence, compelled his obedience. Ilara's imagination supplied the details, the epic only hinted at, the frantic, secretive industry that must have followed, the confusion of his family, the sidelong glances of his servants, the mountains of bitumen hauled from distant seeps, heating in great pots until the air shimmered with its acrid tarry scent, the groaning of saws as enormous trunks of cedar from far-off Lebanon were shaped. The epic gave precise, almost absurd dimensions, a perfect cube, 7 stories high, with 9 compartments. In her mind, it rose not as a sleek vessel, but as a monstrous geometric obscurity on the plain, a dark ziggurat meant for horizontal travel, its sides gleaming with hot pitch. For days and nights the rhythmic thud of mallets driving dowels, the shouts of foremen, the creak of ropes, Utnapishtim overseeing it all, a man building a world inside a world based on a whispered sentence, while the indifferent sun beat down and his city buzzed with rumours of his folly. Then, the loading, not the orderly procession of a fable, but a chaotic, heartbreaking influx, the bellowing of cattle driven up ramps, the bleating of sheep, the confused clucking of fowl in wicker cages, the scurrying of mice and insects, the unseen seeds of every plant, gathered in clay pots, his own family, their faces pale with fear and doubt, climbing into the shadowy interior, the final profound moment when the great door was swung shut and sealed from the outside with pitch, plunging them into a hot, dark womb of wood and animal breath. the silence inside, waiting. Then the first distant rumble in the dawn. The storm, when it came, was of a magnitude that shattered language. The epic said it terrified even the gods who fled to the highest heaven and cowered like dogs. Elara saw it, the sky tearing open, not with rain but with a solid crushing weight of water, a wind that ripped the very landscape into the air, a darkness so total it erased the line between earth and sky. Inside the boat, a hell of noise, the shrieking timbers, the screaming of the wind, the panicked roar and thrash of every living thing within, the deafening drumbeat of the deluge on the roof. The vessel, that massive clumsy box, was lifted from the earth as if by a giant hand, spun and tossed in a chaos that made the concepts of up and down meaningless. For 6 days and 7 nights, this maelstrom reigned. On the 7th day, it ceased as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise, a vast, drowned, suffocating quiet. Utnapishtim opened a window. Light, actual light, fell into the darkness. He looked out upon a universe of water, flat, motionless, and utterly desolate. No landmarks, no life, just a grey sea meeting a grey sky. The boat was adrift on this liquid void. Elara felt the crushing weight of that loneliness, the absolute isolation of being the only heartbeat in a finished world. Then, the grounding, a jolt that resonated through the great frame. They had come to rest on Mount Nemush. The boat held fast, unmoving, as the waters began their slow, inexorable retreat, draining from the mountainsides with a sound like a dying sigh. The sending of the birds was a ritual of agonizing slowness. A dove released. It circled the lifeless world and returned, finding no perch. A swallow sent forth. It too returned. Finally a raven. It flew away and did not come back. The raven's failure to return was the first true sign of hope. It had found land and food, and had chosen the reborn earth over the ark. When Utnapishtim opened the great door and emerged, the air was cold and sharp, smelling of mud and stone. The world was raw, naked, washed clean of every sin and every city. He built an altar of stones upon the mountain top, and made a sacrifice, the sweet smoke curling upward into the vast empty sky. The gods, smelling the savour, gathered around like flies. Their wrath had cooled, replaced by a kind of stunned regret at the totality of their destruction. Enlil, the storm god who had demanded the flood, was initially furious to find survivors, but Ea rebuked him, arguing for wisdom and mercy. As a recompense for surviving their judgment, the gods granted Utnapishtim and his wife the gift of immortality. They would live forever, like the gods, but apart, at the mouth of the rivers. They became living relics of the old world, permanent witnesses to the flood. Elara closed the book, the final image lingering. Utnapishtim the faraway, not just a survivor, but a monument. His immortality was not a triumphant apotheosis, but a solemn, lonely charge to be the eternal keeper of the memory. The boat upon the mountain was not merely a vehicle of salvation, it was a seed pod stranded on the peak of a new beginning, its story the germ of the future. The awe she felt was tinged with a profound solemnity. This was not a story of escape, but of transformation through utter devastation. The gift of eternal life was less a reward than a burden of testimony, ensuring that the tale of the waters that once covered everything would never be forgotten, echoing down the ages to a woman reading by a lamp, feeling the ghost of that first desperate hope take root in the quiet of her own heart. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 5, A Covenant in the Rain, Part 1, asterisk, asterisk. The road to the monastery was a serpent of slick, dark asphalt coiling up through the pine forests of a remote mountain range. A persistent, misting rain had followed Elara's journey, softening the world into a watercolour of grey and green, blurring the edges of the peaks until they seemed like ancient, sleeping giants. When the taxi finally departed, leaving her alone before the heavy oak gates, the silence was absolute, broken only by the steady patter on the canopy of leaves and the distant melancholy call of a single bird. This was not a place one happened upon. It was a destination sought, a deliberate retreat from the noise of the contemporary world into a sanctuary of parchment and silence. The monastery of St. Athanasius clung to the mountainside, its stone walls the colour of the low clouds. As if it had grown from the rock itself, a solitary black-robed brother greeted her with a silent nod, his face a map of quiet contemplation, and led her through a cloistered courtyard where rainwater collected in a mossy stone basin. The air was cold and carried the scent of wet stone, incense, and the faint sweet decay of old paper. Her destination was the library, a long vaulted hall where the only light fell in dusty shafts from high narrow windows, illuminating the swirling motes in the air. Rows of dark wooden carrels faced shelves that groaned under the weight of leather-bound codices and stacked manuscript boxes. The atmosphere was one of serene isolation, a palpable peace that felt like a held breath spanning centuries. Alara had come to examine a treasure, a collection of early medieval manuscripts containing the Book of Genesis, specifically the Noah narrative. With the gentle assistance of the monastery's archivist, another silent figure who communicated in whispers and careful gestures, a folio was laid before her on a padded rest. It was not the famed, illuminated manuscripts of later centuries, but a simpler, earlier text, its vellum pages thick and creamy, the Latin script a disciplined, unadorned march of ink. The words were familiar, yet here, in this rain-wrapped silence, they resonated with a new and profound gravity. She began to read, not as a scholar cross-referencing sources, but as a pilgrim arriving at a wellspring. The story unfolded with a stark moral clarity that distinguished it from the Mesopotamian epics. Here, the flood was not a capricious decision of squabbling deities, but an act of divine judgment emanating from a singular, righteous God. The corruption and violence of humanity had become so profound that it grieved the Creator's heart. The moral dimension was inescapable. The waters were an ethical purge, a terrible necessity to wash away a world that had chosen wickedness over its foundational covenant. Alara's finger hovered over the lines describing Noah. He was not a king or a sage warmed through cryptic riddles, but a righteous man who walked with God. His salvation was predicated on his character, a beacon of integrity in a condemned landscape. The instruction to build the ark was direct, detailed, and unambiguously divine, a commandment of precise measurements and specific purpose. As the soft rain whispered against the library's leaded glass, Alara delved into the heart of this version's power, the covenant. In the earlier stories, survival was its own reward, sometimes followed by a gift of immortality or a place in a distant paradise. But here, after the sacrifice on Ararat, God made a promise. He set his bow in the clouds, the rainbow. It was not merely a symbol of beauty after storm, but a divine weapon, as it were, laid aside. The bow that could unleash arrows of rain was now hung up, its arc pointing away from the earth, a sign of a unilateral pledge. Never again would all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. The relationship between creator and creation was re-established not on a foundation of fear, but on a foundation of promise. The flood story, therefore, became not just a tale of destruction, but the origin story of divine mercy and guaranteed continuity. The preservation of life in the ark was an act of selective grace, and the rainbow was the seal on a new, enduring contract. This concept of a promise etched across the sky with water and light stirred a deep, personal reflection in Alara. Her own search through these layered narratives was, in its way, a search for promises in the past. Not divine ones, but human promises, the implicit vow that memory makes to the future, that a story told and retold carries a truth beyond its facts. Sitting in the hushed library, she saw Noah's Ark as the ultimate vessel of memory, carrying not just animal pairs, but the very possibility of a future story, a continued narrative for humanity. The covenant was a promise that the story would have a sequel, that the world would continue, and with it, the human endeavour to understand its place within it. Her own life's work felt like a faint echo of that archetype. She was gathering the scattered seeds of stories, the paired fragments of myth from different cultures, and placing them in the ark of her own understanding, hoping to preserve their meaning, to discern the pattern of their survival. The rainbow's promise was one of pattern itself, the assurance that the relationship between cause and effect, between action and consequence, and between devastation and renewal, held a discernible, if often painful, logic. The flood was a reset, but a reset with a rule, This particular form of total annihilation would not be repeated. It gave history a linear direction, moving from a cleansed past toward a future under a signed sky. The rain outside intensified for a moment, drumming a soft tattoo on the roof before settling back into its gentle murmur. Elara looked from the vellum page to the window, where the grey light was beginning to soften with a faint pearlescent glow. No rainbow appeared, but she felt its conceptual presence. In this remote library, the Hebrew flood narrative revealed itself as a profound theological and psychological innovation. It addressed the trauma of universal catastrophe, not just with a survival mechanism, but with a framework for hope that was built into the very fabric of the cosmos. The waters of judgment receded to reveal not just dry land, but the foundation for trust. Her search for the roots of the paradox had led her here, to a story where the answer to the fear of obliteration was a permanent, colourful scar across the heavens, a promise whispered in every drop of rain, a covenant ensuring that the story of the world, in all its mystery and moral complexity, was far from over. Asterisk. Chapter 5. A Covenant in the Rain. Part 2. Asterisk. The logistical reality of the Ark, as Elara contemplated it in the monastery's stillness, was a story in itself, one written not in divine command, but in the gritty, overwhelming details of survival. The dimensions given in the text, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, translated in her mind from sacred numbers into a staggering physical space, a vast, dark, floating warehouse. She closed her eyes, letting the scholarly analysis fall away to imagine the human and animal experience within that sealed wooden world during the 40 days and nights of rain, and the agonizingly slow recession of the waters. The sound would have been a constant, oppressive presence, not the roar of the storm outside, which was muffled by thick timbers and pitch, but the interior symphony of confinement, the creak and groan of the massive hull under the pressure of endless waves, the drip of condensation from the ceilings, the rustle of straw and the scratch of claws on wood, the lowing, bleating, chirping and howling of thousands of creatures, a cacophony of fear and disorientation that rose and fell but never ceased. Over it all, the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof, a tattoo that marked the passage of time in a world without sun or stars, a sound that would seep into dreams and waking moments alike, becoming the very pulse of this artificial reality. Then, the smells, the sweet pungent odour of fresh-cut timber and hot pitch would have been quickly overwhelmed. The thick, warm scent of animal bodies, of wool and hide and feathers, the sharp tang of urine and the earthy reek of manure, accumulating in the straw despite frantic ongoing efforts to manage it, the damp, fungal smell of wet wood and mouldering fodder, the close human scent of sweat and breath and unwashed clothing, of fear and prayer and weary labour. The air would have been heavy, humid, and thick with the particulate of life packed too closely together, a olfactory testament to the sheer messy biomass being preserved against the void. The confinement was psychological as much as physical. For Noah and his family, the Ark was not a ship with a destination, but a prison of faith. They could not steer it. Their entire existence was reduced to the rhythms of feeding, watering and cleaning, a relentless Sisyphean labour performed in the dim, oil lamp glow. The world they had known, the fields, the hills, the neighbours, however wicked, was gone, replaced by the four walls of their belief. Every sound from the outside was a reminder of the annihilation they alone had escaped, a burden of survival that must have weighed heavier with each passing day. The close quarters would have frayed nerves, magnified small irritations into profound tensions. The miracle was not just the preservation of life, but the preservation of sanity within that floating sepulchre. And then the rain stopped. The sudden silence, when it came, would have been shocking, a physical presence more deafening than the storm. The drumming ceased. Only the lap of water against the hull and the interior noises remained. That external silence was the first sign of a change, but it was a terrifying one. It meant they were adrift on a grave, a global ocean covering every landmark, every memory. The waiting began anew, a more profound and lonely vigil. The waters assuaged, decreasing slowly over months. The Ark grounded with a soft grating shudder on the mountains of Ararat. Then, the most profound silence of all. the silence of a finished world. No wind in trees, no call of birds, no distant human voice. Just the drip of water from the receding flood and the vast empty sigh of a planet breathing out after drowning. When the door was finally opened, the world that greeted them was not the one destroyed. It was raw, blank and glistening, a canvas of mud and rock under a painfully bright sky. The familiar was utterly erased. This, Alara realized, was the true reset, not merely a punishment, but a return to a primordial state, a ** tabula rasa, asterisk upon which a new human story could be written, this time under the sign of the rainbow. The logistical nightmare of the voyage, the sensory overload of the ark, culminated in this profound, hollow quiet, the sound of absolute potential and absolute loss intertwined. The flood story, in this light, was the ultimate second chance narrative. Every civilization that told a version of it was performing a profound act of imaginative hope. It allowed a people to process their own historical traumas, whether local inundations, invasions, plagues, or social collapses, by projecting them onto a cosmic scale and then providing a template for survival and renewal. The world is destroyed because of its flaws, but it is not the end. A remnant is saved. A fresh start is not only possible but divinely sanctioned. The story asserts that even from total failure, a new beginning can be built, and that this new beginning carries the wisdom of the catastrophe within it, like seeds saved in the ark. Sitting in the rain-softened silence of the monastery, Alara saw the flood paradox not as a problem of historical transmission, but as a testament to a universal human longing, whether born from a single cataclysm or from the repeated local experience of water's destructive power. The story served a deep psychological and cultural need. It was a mechanism for coping with the fear of annihilation, for asserting that human morality matters in the cosmos, and most importantly, for nurturing the radical hope that no matter how profound the failure, how deep the corruption, or how total the disaster, the story does not have to end. There can be an ark, there can be a mountain, there can be a covenant. Every civilization, looking back at its own floods, real or metaphorical, could see in this ancient narrative a promise that after the last rain there is always the possibility of an empty, waiting world, and the chance to build something new from the saved seeds of what came before. The story allowed them to imagine, again and again, a second chance for humanity. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 6. The Waters of New. Asterisk, asterisk. The heat of the Egyptian day was a tangible weight, a dry, shimmering presence that pressed upon the skin and bleached the sky to a pale metallic blue. But as Dr. Alara Vance walked along the earthen bank of the Nile just south of Luxor, the sun began its descent, and the world softened. The fierce light mellowed into gold, then apricot, then a deep bruised rose, each hue reflected and doubled in the great river's slow, muscular flow. The air, still warm, carried the damp, fertile scent of water and blooming lotus, a smell as ancient as the stone temples that lined the horizon. Here, the flood story was not a memory of trauma, but a rhythm, a promise written in the annual rise and fall of the waters themselves. Ilara's thoughts drifted from the storm-swept arcs of Mesopotamia to a different kind of beginning. She recalled the Egyptian creation myth, born not in the highlands but in the endless flat expanse of primordial nothingness. Before time there was only new, the dark, limitless, inert ocean, a perfect, silent, potential-filled void. Then, from those waters, a mound of fertile silt emerged, the first land, and upon it the self-created god Atum rose, bringing light, differentiation, and the first generation of deities into being. This was a flood, not of destruction, but of pure, pregnant potential. The world did not emerge asterisk after asterisk, a deluge, but asterisk from asterisk one. The waters of New were not a punishment, they were the source, the cosmic womb. The annual inundation of the Nile was a reenactment of this first creative emergence, the river swelling, spreading its life-giving silt over the fields, and receding to reveal the black, fertile earth, ready to be sown. It was a flood that brought life, not death. The contrast with the Mesopotamian narratives was profound. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, floods were violent, unpredictable and terrifying, chaotic surges that could erase cities without warning. The stories born there reflected that trauma, divine wrath, desperate survival, a fragile covenant. But here, the Nile's inundation was predictable, its rise and fall tracked with meticulous precision by temple priests. It was the heartbeat of the civilization, not its potential heart attack. The flood was awaited, celebrated, and deified as Hapi, the god of the annual inundation, depicted as a plump blue or green-skinned figure bearing offerings of lotus and papyrus, a personification of abundance. The following morning, in the cool, shadowed halls of a small archaeological museum, Ilara examined artifacts that spoke of this harmonious relationship. There were nilometers, carved stone columns used to measure the river's rise. Their precise graduations a testament to a culture that sought not to escape the flood, but to understand and harness its rhythm. She studied votive statues of Hapi and fragments of reliefs showing pharaohs ceremonially cutting the first channel to guide the inundation waters into the irrigation basins. The artifacts spoke of a dialogue with the river, a partnership. The water was a benevolent, if powerful, force to be managed, not a capricious enemy to be feared. She had arranged to meet with an Egyptologist, Dr. Rashid, a man with a calm, measured voice that seemed to match the eternal pace of the river he studied. They sat in the museum's quiet courtyard, under the shade of a palm tree, drinking sweet, dark tea. Ilara shared her observations about the stark contrast between the flood myths of the two river valley civilizations. Dr. Rashid nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "You have perceived the essential difference," he said. "The Tigris and Euphrates are wild, youthful rivers, fed by snowmelt from the Anatolian highlands. Their floods are sudden, violent, and often destructive. They come in spring, sometimes at the wrong time for planting. The trauma is in their unpredictability." He gestured vaguely northward. "But the Nile is a gentleman. Its flood comes from the summer monsoon rains far to the south. In the Ethiopian highlands, it arrives predictably in late summer, peaks and recedes by November, leaving a perfect layer of rich silt just in time for the winter planting season. It is a cycle, not a catastrophe. Our stories reflect that. We have no epic of a survivor on a boat because in a fundamental sense, we are all survivors on the boat of the Nile every year. The boat is the entire Black Land itself, carried and renewed by the flood." He went on to explain that while Egypt did have stories of cosmic disorder and the god Seth bringing chaos, they lacked a singular, world-annihilating deluge narrative. The closest parallel was the myth of the solar god Ra, who, disgusted with humanity's rebellion, sent the eye of his daughter, the goddess Sekhmet, to slaughter them. She became a raging, bloodthirsty force, and Ra had to trick her by flooding the land with beer dyed red to look like blood, which she drank, becoming pacified. Even this story of near destruction ended not with a lone survivor on a mountain, but with a clever restorative trick that preserved humanity. The flood here was a soporific, not a solvent. Walking back along the river at dusk, Ilara felt the conceptual shift settle within her. The paradox of the global flood myth was not monolithic. It was refracted through the prism of environment. A civilization shaped by a benevolent, predictable river would mythologize water as a creative, cyclical force. A civilization shaped by violent, unpredictable floods would birth stories of divine punishment and desperate salvation. Both were true to their lived experience. The waters of Nu were always there, in every culture's subconscious, the primordial, potential-filled sea. But whether those waters manifested in myth as a creative womb or as a destructive deluge depended entirely on the relationship between the people and the rivers that sustained them. The Nile, with its gentle, life-giving inundation, offered a different answer to the question posed by the waters. Not how do we survive your wrath, but how do we give thanks for your gift, soul. The flood was not an end, but a beginning, repeated every year, a perpetual covenant written not in a rainbow, but in the rich black earth left behind, as the waters gently receded. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 7, The Sage and the Dragon, asterisk, asterisk. The garden was a world of ordered tranquility, a deliberate composition of rock, water, and meticulously pruned foliage that seemed to breathe with a slow vegetative patience. Dr. Ilara Vance sat on a simple wooden bench beside a koi pond, the water so still it perfectly mirrored the grey silk of the sky and the elegant curve of a stone bridge. This was not a wild place, but a testament to centuries of human intention, where every moss-covered boulder and twisted pine had been placed to suggest a greater, harmonious nature. Here, in this cultivated stillness, she contemplated a flood story that was not about an ark, but about a channel, not about divine rescue, but about human mastery. The story was that of Great Yu, the legendary founder of China's Xia dynasty, and his epic battle against a world drowned not by rain from the heavens, but by the chaotic, rebellious waters of the earth itself. Unlike the sudden cataclysmic deluges of other myths, the Great Flood of Chinese tradition was a prolonged, relentless disaster, a time when waters swelled up to the heavens, not for 40 days, but for generations. It was a permanent state of inundation, a world refusing to be shaped, its rivers overflowing their courses and merging into a universal swamp that stifled all life and agriculture. The response to this crisis, as Ilara read from the ancient texts, was not a plea to the gods or the building of a floating refuge. It was the story of Yuka's labour. Yu's father, Gun, had attempted to control the waters by building dikes and barriers, a strategy of confrontation that failed spectacularly, leading to his execution. Yu learned from this failure. He understood that water could not be simply opposed, it had to be understood, guided, persuaded. He was appointed to the task, and for 13 years, some said 30, he traversed the drowned world, surveying and mapping the chaotic waterways. He lived as a common labourer, his hands calloused, his body caked in mud, his clothes ragged. He passed his own house 3 times in his travels, hearing the cries of his newborn children, but did not enter, so consumed was he by his public duty. His method was one of relentless, methodical ingenuity, dredging riverbeds, cutting channels through mountains, creating outlets to the sea. He did not conquer the flood, he gave it a path, transforming the chaotic, drowning expanse into an orderly network of rivers and irrigation canals. The waters, thus guided, receded to reveal the fertile plains of the central states, and Yu became a sage king, the patron of engineers and administrators. Ilara watched a single koi glide beneath the pond's surface, its movement a study in effortless direction. Yu's story was the philosophical opposite of Noah's or Utnapishtim's. Here, the theme was not human submission to divine will, but human mastery over nature through wisdom, perseverance and self-sacrifice. The flood was not a divine punishment for moral failing, but a cosmological problem of imbalance between the watery element and the earthly. It was a technical challenge to be solved by virtue and intellect. Yu's success affirmed a core tenet of Chinese thought, that harmony between humanity and the natural world could be achieved not through passive acceptance, but through active, intelligent intervention. The right leader, embodying diligence and wisdom, could literally reshape the world. This narrative was deeply intertwined with the geography that spawned it. China's great rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze, were life-givers, but their floods were legendary for their scale and destructiveness, carrying massive loads of silt that could raise riverbeds above the surrounding plains. Living with these rivers required constant, large-scale, coordinated hydrological management. The myth of Yu provided a divine archetype for this endless civilizational project. It justified the immense state-directed labor of building and maintaining levees, canals, and irrigation systems. The Sage King was the first and greatest water conservancy officer, and his story sanctified the bureaucratic collective effort required to survive and thrive in that landscape. The flood myth here was a foundation myth for the state itself, for the idea that order, social, political, and environmental, was something constructed through human virtue and toil. Ilara's gaze shifted from the placid pond to a nearby rock arrangement, a miniature mountainscape of weathered limestone. In some versions of the myth, Yu's struggle was not merely against impersonal waters, but against a watery dragon or a chaotic serpent that embodied the flood's chaotic spirit. His victory was also a taming of this primal, chthonic force. The dragon, a symbol of water, power, and potential chaos in Chinese culture, was not slain but subdued. Integrated into the new order, it became a symbol of imperial authority and the balanced dynamic power of nature when properly governed. This too reflected a different relationship with the divine. The gods in this story were not capricious beings sending destruction. They were more like celestial ministers, with the Emperor of Heaven appointing you to solve a problem. Divinity was expressed through righteous action and administrative success. The slow, methodical rhythm of the garden, the drip of water from a bamboo pipe into a stone basin, the almost imperceptible growth of the moss mirrored the patient, persistent labour of you. There was no single dramatic moment of salvation, no door opening onto a new world. There was only the cumulative effect of countless small actions, a channel dug here, a levee reinforced there, a mountain pass carved over years. The flood receded not by divine fiat, but by inches and miles of human effort. The narrative itself reflected this, lacking the tight, dramatic arc of the Mesopotamian or Hebrew stories. It was a chronicle of process. Sitting in the tranquil space, Elara felt the profound contrast settle within her intellectual journey. The flood paradox was not one story with many faces, but a cluster of deep cultural dreams born from specific conversations between people and their environment. The unpredictable, violent rivers of Mesopotamia birthed stories of survival by grace. The predictable, life-giving Nile inspired a myth of creative emergence, and the vast, silt-laden, tamed but temperamental rivers of China produced a legend of mastery through virtuous toil. Each civilization's foundational flood myth was a mirror held up to its deepest values, its greatest fears, and its chosen strategies for enduring in a world where water held the power of life and death. The sage did not wait for the dragon to relent. He studied its nature and showed it a better path to the sea. In the quiet of the garden, the message was clear. Some civilizations dream of arcs, others of rainbows, and some dream of shovels, patience, and the slow, sure work of directing the flood toward a future of their own making. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 8. Voices in the Andes. Part 1. Asterisk. The air at this altitude was a thin, cold wine, each breath a conscious effort that sharpened the senses to a needle's point. Dr. Elara Vance stood on a bare, wind-scoured shoulder of the Andes, the world falling away in a dizzying tapestry of deep valleys and serrated peaks that clawed at a sky of impossible crystalline blue. Below, a thread of silver marked a river's distant course. Above, condors traced slow, patient circles on thermals. She had come to this remote Peruvian village, not for ruins or artifacts, but for a voice, a living thread in the oral tapestry she had been tracing across the globe. Here, the story of the Great Flood was not called a myth. It was a memory held in the breath and bones of the mountains themselves. It was called Unu Pachakuti, the Great Water Overturning. The elder's name was Tomas, though the villagers referred to him with a Quechua term that meant the one who remembers. His home was a simple adobe structure with a corrugated metal roof, but it sat at the very edge of the settlement, where the cultivated terraces gave way to the raw mineral scent of the high puna. He welcomed her without ceremony, his face a landscape of deep wrinkles carved by sun and wind, his eyes the colour of dark obsidian, holding a light that seemed to look through her, into the fabric of time. They sat on low stools by a smouldering hearth, the smoke curling up to a hole in the roof, the only warmth in the shadowed room. He did not speak immediately. He seemed to be listening, gathering the silence around him like a cloak. When he began, his voice was low and gravelled, not with age alone, but with the weight of what it carried. He spoke in Quechua, his words translated by his granddaughter, a young woman named Luz, whose own voice was soft and reverent. The telling was not a linear narrative, but an atmospheric weaving, a conjuring of a state of being. He did not start with the flood. He started with the connection, the sacred, breathing link between the water, the mountains, and the stars. He described the world as it was before the overturning, a time when the Apis, the mountain spirits, walked openly among people, and the rivers sang clear songs that carried prayers directly to the heavens. The stars, he said, were not distant lights, but the eyes of the ancestors, watching from the dark fabric of the night. Water was the blood of the Pachamama, the Earth Mother, flowing through her veins of stone and soil, giving life to the potatoes and quinoa, to the llamas and the people. It was a time of balance, but also of forgetting. As Luz translated, Tomas's hands moved slowly, sculpting the air, tracing the paths of streams and the contours of peaks. His words painted a world where every spring was a shrine, every rainfall a blessing to be acknowledged with a whispered prayer. But the people, he said, grew deaf to the songs. They took the water without thanks, polluted the springs with their carelessness, and quarrelled among themselves, their hearts growing as hard and cold as the highest glaciers. Then Tomas's voice changed. It grew deeper, taking on a rhythmic, prophetic quality. The overturning did not come from the sky as a rain, he explained. It came from within the earth itself, and from the melting heart of the great white mountains. The Apus, angered by the disrespect and the wickedness festering in the hearts of men, withdrew their protection. The glaciers, the eternal sources of life-giving water, began to weep uncontrollably, not with gentle melt, but with a catastrophic, sorrowful gush. At the same time, the oceans, sensing the imbalance, reared up and rushed inland. But more than this, the very springs and lakes and underground rivers revolted, bursting forth with a power that shattered the land. This was Unu Pachakuti, not a flood from above, but a total violent inversion of the world's waters. The liquid heart of the earth rose to the surface, and the sky wept in sympathy, creating a unity of deluge from below and above. He described the terror, not in terms of waves, but of sound, a deep groaning roar as the mountains themselves seemed to moan, the cacophony of boulders torn loose and grinding together in the muddy torrents, the screams of people and animals swallowed by the churning chaos, the valleys filled not with water, but with a thick, roiling soup of earth and rock and uprooted trees. The world that had been vertical, the proud peaks, the stepped terraces, was made horizontal, a single raging plain of brown destruction. The stars, the ancestors' eyes, closed in grief, plunging the world into a darkness broken only by the ghostly phosphorescence of the churning waters. Then, the focus of his story narrowed, like a beam of light finding a single point in the devastation. He spoke of two survivors, a brother and sister. They were not described as particularly righteous, but as lucky, or perhaps chosen by a residual spark of the old respect. They had been high on the slopes, tending a remote shrine to the Apus, when the overturning began. As the waters rose, they climbed, desperate, until they reached a cave near the summit of a mighty peak, a place sacred to the mountain's spirit. The floodwaters swirled at the cave's mouth but did not enter, as if the mountain itself had formed a protective breath around them. There, in the cold, dark belly of the Apu, they waited, listening to the world drown. For a long time, Tomas fell silent, his eyes closed. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the relentless wind moaning against the eaves. Ilara felt the story settling in the room, not as a tale, but as a presence. When he spoke again, his voice was weary, but softened with a hint of dawn. The waters, having purged the world of its wickedness, slowly drained away, finding new courses, carving new canyons. The brother and sister emerged from the cave onto a raw, silent world, its contours forever changed, glistening under the reopened eyes of the stars. They were alone, the ancestors of all who came after. But they were not alone, Tomas insisted. The Apus were with them. The covenant was not written in a rainbow, but etched into the very stone of their survival. The mountains had provided the final refuge. Therefore, the people born from these two would forever be in covenant with the mountains. They must honour the Apus, care for the waters, and remember that the high places were not just stone but saviours. The world was repopulated from that cave, a world forever mindful that the blood of the Pachamama could rise again if the balance was broken. As the last word was translated, the telling seemed to hang in the smoky air. Tomas looked at Elira, his obsidian eyes holding hers. He had not told her a story. He had allowed her to witness a memory held in the land's own voice. The connection he described, water, mountain, star, was not metaphor here. It was the fundamental ecology of belief. Unu Pachakuti was not an ancient event, but a permanent possibility, a warning woven into the landscape. Sitting in the dim hut, with the Andean wind as a constant chorus outside, Elera felt the flood paradox deepen into something more profound and more elemental. This was a story not of a boat, but of a cave, not of a divine promise, but of a terrestrial covenant. The waters had not just cleansed the world, they had forged an unbreakable bond between the survivors and the towering, silent gods of stone that had offered them the last highest piece of earth. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 8. Voices in the Andes, Part 2. Asterisk. 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 The thin, cold light of dawn found Alara hiking a steep, winding trail above the village, the words of Thomas the Elder still echoing in the chambers of her mind like a chant. Luz accompanied her, moving with the sure-footed grace of one born to these slopes. Their destination was an archaeological site, a place where the story of Unu Pachakuti shifted from the realm of breath and memory into the silent, stubborn language of stone. The air remained painfully clear, each breath a conscious act, and the rising sun painted the snowcaps of distant peaks with a fierce pink fire. As they climbed, the village below diminished into a scattering of coloured blocks, and the immense scale of the landscape asserted itself, a world of colossal tectonic drama where the very bones of the planet were exposed. The site was not a city or a temple, but a geological exposure on a mountainside, a place where a recent rockslide had peeled back the skin of the earth to reveal its deeper history. A team of local archaeologists, working in partnership with the community, had cordoned off the area. As they approached, Alara saw the raw, fresh scar on the slope, a vertical face of layered sediment that stood like a giant open book. Luz spoke with the site supervisor, a young geologist named Marco, whose enthusiasm was barely contained by the solemnity of the altitude. He welcomed Alara with a brisk nod and led her to the base of the exposure. "Look here," he said, his voice hushed with a kind of scientific reverence. He pointed his trowel at a distinct thick band in the stratigraphy, a layer of chaotic, unsorted material sandwiched between orderly deposits of fine silt and volcanic ash. "This is what we came to see. It is not a mud brick wall or a pottery shard. It is a debris flow deposit, a **** on a monumental scale." He explained that the orderly layers represented millennia of quiet accumulation, wind-blown dust, ash from distant eruptions, the slow, patient sedimentation of an ancient lake that once filled this valley. But the chaotic band told a different story. It contained boulders the size of small cars, rounded cobbles, jagged fragments of bedrock, and a matrix of coarse sand and clay, all jumbled together in a violent, turbulent mixture. This was not the work of a gentle river or a slow landslide. This was evidence of a catastrophic, high-energy slurry of water and rock that had roared down from the higher peaks with unimaginable force, scouring the valley and depositing its chaotic load in a single devastating event. "The dating is preliminary," Marco continued, his eyes alight, "but it places this event roughly 4,000 years ago, and it is not isolated. We have correlative deposits in 3 other valleys within a 50-kilometre radius. Something happened, a period of extreme seismic activity, coupled with a rapid, sustained melting of the glaciers, or perhaps a colossal landslide that dammed and then burst a high-altitude lake. The result was not just a flood, it was a remaking of the landscape, a true Pachakuti, an overturning." Alara stood before the striated face, her hand hovering near the cold stone. Here was the physical echo of the elder's story. The great water overturning was not merely a metaphor for moral cleansing, it was a precise description of a geological reality. The chaotic band was Unu Pachakuti's signature, written in the Earth's own ledger. The oral tradition had preserved the memory of this cataclysm with astonishing fidelity. Not the dates or the scientific mechanism, but the essential truth. A time when the mountains wept destructively, when water and earth merged into a single terrifying force that reshaped the world. The 2 survivors in the cave were the human focal point, the narrative lens through which the incomprehensible scale of the event could be understood and endured. That evening, Alara chose not to return to the village immediately. As the sun dipped behind the western Cordillera, she found a flat rock overlooking the vast, darkening basin and sat, wrapping herself in a thick woolen blanket. The temperature plummeted, and the sky transformed into a deep, velvety black, unpolluted by any artificial light. Then the stars emerged, not the familiar sparse scattering of northern skies, but a breathtaking milky torrent, the spine of the galaxy arching directly overhead, so bright it cast faint, blue shadows on the ground. The air was so clear each star seemed a piercing diamond-hard point of ancient fire. Sitting under this immensity, she felt the vast scale of human memory, not as an abstraction but as a physical weight. The story of the flood was here, in the Andean sediment and in the Quechua elder's breath. It was in the Mesopotamian clay and the Hebrew vellum. It was in the Dreamtime songs of Australia and the chronicles of Great U. The sheer overwhelming distribution of the narrative across space and time filled her with a quiet awe. She let the old haunting questions surface once more, stripped now of academic pretense, laid bare under the cold stars. Did the story travel? Was Unu Pachakuti a distant cousin of Utnapishtim's ordeal, carried across the Bering Land Bridge by the first peoples of the Americas, evolving over millennia to fit the mountain cosmology? It was possible. Human migration was a story of stories, carried in minds across continents. A tale of world-drowning water would be a potent heirloom for peoples navigating coastlines and crossing rivers, a warning and a survival template, etched into collective memory. Or was the story born separately, again and again from a shared traumatic experience with a changing planet? She looked up at the brilliant, indifferent stars, the epoch Thomas and Marco pointed to. 4,000 years ago, fell within a period many climatologists called the 4.2 kiloyear event, a time of abrupt climate shift marked by severe droughts in some regions and catastrophic flooding in others, driven by the final violent convulsions of the last ice age's demise. Glaciers were melting, sea levels were rising, and vast freshwater lakes trapped behind ice dams were bursting in apocalyptic floods across the northern hemisphere. Could the same climatic spasms have triggered the glacial outburst floods that scarred the Andes? Was the core of the flood myth not a single event, but a species-wide memory of that tumultuous transition when the great ice sheets sighed their last, and water reasserted its dominion in 1,000 terrifying ways? The story would then be a birth cry of the Holocene, the anxious, awe-struck song of humanity emerging into a warmer, wetter, and profoundly unstable world. A shooting star streaked silently across the galactic river, a brief burning scratch on the dark. Ilara felt no closer to a definitive answer, and the lack of resolution was strangely peaceful. The paradox was not a lock to be picked, but a resonance to be felt. Here, under the Andean stars, with the evidence of a real Unu Pachakuti in the rock beside her, and its living memory in the village below, the two possibilities, diffusion and independent emergence, did not seem mutually exclusive. They intertwined like the strands of a rope. Perhaps some stories did travel with migrating peoples, taking root in new soil, and perhaps the same climatic forces that birthed the story in one continent also created the conditions for its independent invention in another, as human societies from Mesopotamia to Peru confronted the unleashed power of melting ice and rising waters. The shared traumatic experience with a changing world provided the fertile global ground. The movement of people provided the seeds. The result was the same profound, recurring dream. Dressed in the local garments of mountain spirits, storm gods, or rainbow serpents, the cold began to seep through the blanket, a sharp, clean cold that spoke of ice and altitude. Ilara stood, her joints stiff, and took one last look at the star-dusted peaks, black silhouettes against the celestial glow. They were the same mountains that had offered a cave to the survivors, that held the geological record of the cataclysm, and that now stood as eternal witnesses to the long, slow conversation between human memory and the Earth's own violent history. The voices in the Andes were not just human, they were the voice of the rock, the water, and the ice, telling the same story in different tongues. She turned and began the careful descent back to the village, carrying with her the profound sense that the flood was not a myth from a forgotten past, but a deep rhythmic pulse in the very heart of the world, remembered in stone and star and story. Chapter 9. The Island That Sank. The rain in Cambridge was a soft, persistent grey drizzle, the kind that seeped into the stone of the colleges and muted the world to a palette of slate and faded green. In her book-lined study, with a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, Dr. L.R. Vance felt the melancholy of 100 lost worlds settle around her. After the raw vertical drama of the Andes, she had returned to the horizontal realm of texts, to stories not of mountains that saved, but of lands that vanished beneath the waves. Here, the flood myth transformed from a memory of survival into an elegy for a sunken home, a dreamlike haunting by lands that existed only in the echo of their drowning. She opened a well-worn translation of Plato's Asterisk, Timaeus, Asterisk, and Asterisk, Critias Asterisk. The account of Atlantis was not presented as myth, but as a historical record passed down from the wise Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawgiver Solon. Plato's description was vivid, precise, and hauntingly plausible. An island continent beyond the Pillars of Hercules, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a marvel of concentric rings of water and land, endowed with a sophisticated, powerful civilization rich in auricalpum and governed by noble, if eventually decadent kings. Its fate was cataclysmic and singular. There occurred violent earthquakes and floods, Plato wrote, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. The story was framed as a moral parable, a cautionary tale of a society that abandoned virtue for imperial ambition, provoking the gods to erase it from the earth. But the details felt grounded. The Great Plain, the elaborate canals, the sudden seismic subsidence. It was a flood story, anchored not to a boat, but to a lost geography, a civilization swallowed whole, leaving no survivors to tell the tale, except as a ghost in a foreign archive. Ilara set Plato aside and turned her gaze to a map of the Celtic world. Her thoughts drifted to the Welsh legend of Contra Gwaelod, the Lowland Hundred. This was not a continent, but a fertile, low-lying kingdom said to have stretched far out into what is now Cardigan Bay. It was protected from the sea by a grate, with sluice gates maintained by a watchman. The story varied, but its core was a failure of vigilance, a moment of human error that became cosmic consequence. In one version, a drunken gatekeeper named Sethan neglected his duty during a storm. In another, a well-meaning but foolish maiden named Mererid let the waters in while fetching a magical cup. The sea rushed through the breached defences, drowning the fields, forests, and 16 splendid cities in a single catastrophic inundation. Bells were said to still toll from submerged churches on calm days, a melancholic soundtrack to a lost world. Contra Gwaelod was a folk memory of land loss, a localized Atlantis where the moral failing was not imperial hubris, but simple negligence, transforming a geological event into a lesson about responsibility and the fragility of human works against the patient, hungry sea. From the cold shores of Wales, her imagination sailed to the warm, tropical waters of the Indian Ocean, to the Tamil legends of Kumari Kandam. This was a vast antediluvian continent south of present-day India, the cradle of the first Tamil civilization, a land of great scholars, poets, and thriving cities. The story spoke of not one, but 2 or 3 successive floods, each swallowing more of this fabled land. The causes were often tied to the arrogance of kings who offended the gods or disrupted the cosmic balance. The waters advanced relentlessly, forcing the survivors northward into present-day India, carrying with them the seeds of language and culture. Kumari Kandam was more than a sunken land. It was a drowned utopia, a golden age lost to the waves, an explanation for cultural origins, and a nostalgic benchmark against which the present was measured. Sitting in the quiet, rain-patterned study, Ilara saw the pattern linking these sunken land stories. They were all flood myths refracted through the lens of geography and nostalgia. Unlike the Ark narratives, which focused on a remnant surviving a temporary global deluge, these were tales of permanent, irrevocable loss. The flood here was not a reset, but an erasure. The tone was inherently melancholic, dreamlike, tinged with the pathos of a world that was and is no more. They served as moral parables, warnings against hubris, negligence, or impiety, but also as etiological myths, explaining why a people lived where they did, or why their culture felt a sense of displacement or decline. The human tendency, she realized, was to mythologize not just survival, but loss itself, to take the raw, terrifying fact of land disappearing beneath rising waters and weave it into a story that gave meaning to the absence. A submerged forest discovered by fishermen became the drowned oaks of Contra Gwaelod. The occasional discovery of marine fossils far inland or on mountaintops could seed stories of vast sunken realms, but beneath the folklore, Elara knew, lay the slow, immense drama of real geological events. The most profound of these was the post-glacial sea level rise. At the end of the last ice age, as the great glaciers melted, global sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet over millennia. This was not a sudden flood, but a creeping, inexorable drowning of the continental shelves. Vast, habitable landscapes, rich coastal plains, river valleys, and archipelagos that had been home to Paleolithic communities for thousands of years were gradually inundated. Doggerland, which once connected Britain to Europe, vanished beneath the North Sea. Sunderland, the extension of Southeast Asia, was fragmented into islands. The Persian Gulf was a fertile valley before it flooded. Entire cultures, their hunting grounds, their sacred sites, their very worlds, were slowly swallowed by the advancing sea. This was not a single day and night of misfortune, but a generational trauma, a slow-motion catastrophe, witnessed over centuries, a relentless retreat before a silent, rising wall of water. The memory of such loss, Elara mused, could easily compress in oral tradition. The slow rise over generations could become a single day and night. The gradual abandonment of coastal settlements could become a dramatic, catastrophic sinking. The folk memory of a time when ancestors lived on land, now under the sea, would be potent and persistent. Plato's Atlantis, with its precise dimensions and sudden end, might be a philosophical fabrication, but it resonated because it tapped into this deep, widespread human experience of land loss. Kantra Gwalod and Kumari Kandam were local expressions of the same global phenomenon, the haunting by a drowned world. The rain tapped a gentle, rhythmic code against the window pane. Elara looked out at the damp courtyard, but her mind's eye saw sunken forests and drowned plains. These stories were not lies, but truths translated into the language of myth. They transformed the impersonal, geological process of sea level rise into a narrative with cause and effect, with heroes and fools, with moral stakes. The water was not just rising, it was punishing, or claiming, or cleansing. The loss was not random, it was a consequence. In mythologizing real geological events, humanity was performing its oldest trick, making the vast, indifferent forces of the earth comprehensible, intimate, and meaningful. The island that sank was never just an island. It was a paradise lost, a lesson inscribed in the waves, a ghost of a world we once knew, calling to us from the silent green depths, with the melancholic beauty of all things that are gone. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 10. The Shared Dream. Asterisk. The familiar silence of her university study was a different creature now. It was no longer the expectant hush of a beginning, but the thoughtful quiet of a synthesis. Dr. Elara Vance stood before a large laminated world map she had pinned to a corkboard. It was not a map of political boundaries or topographic features, but a constellation of small coloured pins, each one marking the documented location of a flood myth, red for the Mesopotamian and Mediterranean basin, blue for the Norse and Celtic, green for the African, yellow for the Asian, white for the Americas, and purple for the Pacific. The pins clustered along coastlines and river valleys, dotted mountain ranges and island chains. They formed a near-universal scatter, a global rash of stories about drowning and deliverance. Stepping back, she saw not a puzzle with missing pieces, but a pattern, a dream shared by the entire human family. Her journey had taken her from the whispering archives to the rain-soaked mound of Çatalhöyük, from the clay of Shuruppak to the vellum of a mountain monastery, from the predictable Nile to the mastered rivers of China, and finally to the voice of the Andes and the ghost of sunken lands. She had collected not answers, but resonances. Now in this quiet room filled with books and the soft hum of the city at dusk, she allowed the scientific theories, the possible seeds of the dream, to parade before her mind's eye, each a compelling but incomplete explanation. The first was the cataclysm from above, the massive comet impact hypothesis. Proponents pointed to ice core samples and sediment layers, suggesting a period of global climatic chaos around 12,800 years ago, possibly triggered by a fragmented comet striking the Earth's atmosphere. The resulting fires, followed by a sudden prolonged winter and then rapid melting, could have inspired deluge legends worldwide. Ilara imagined the sight, a series of fireballs tearing across the sky, a rain of brimstone, then a global winter so deep it seemed the sun had died, followed by torrential rains as the climate reeled. Such an event would be seared into the collective memory of every surviving culture, a trauma written in the stars and the subsequent floods. The story would be one of fire from heaven, and then water from the heavens, a double cataclysm. Yet the myths she knew spoke consistently of water, not fire and ice. The comet was a dramatic candidate, but it felt almost too specific, too neat a fit for a story so universally about drowning. Then there was the more localized but profoundly transformative Black Sea deluge theory. It proposed that as the last ice age waned, the rising Mediterranean Sea catastrophically breached the Bosporus sill around 7,600 years ago, pouring into the freshwater Black Sea lake below. With a force 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, the shoreline would have retreated by a mile a day, drowning an area the size of Florida, displacing thousands of Neolithic farmers, and creating a permanent, rising scar in the memory of the survivors. This event, centered in a region that was a cradle of early agriculture and storytelling, could have radiated outward with migrating populations, carrying the tale of a great inland sea, suddenly and violently born. The image was potent, a wall of salt water swallowing a fertile basin, a real-world event of biblical scale. It provided a plausible, singular source. Yet, could one regional flood, however vast, truly echo in the mountains of Peru and the Dreamtime of Australia, perhaps as a story carried to incredible distances? Yes, but the dream felt older, more deeply rooted. The third, and to Ilara most profound, theory was not a single event, but a universal experience, the Great Melt. The end of the Pleistocene epoch was not a gentle thaw, but a violent, erratic transition. As the continental ice sheets retreated, they released unimaginable volumes of water, vast glacial lakes, trapped behind walls of ice, burst in apocalyptic outburst floods that scoured landscapes from North America to Siberia. Sea levels rose globally by over 100 meters, drowning continental shelves and transforming coastlines over generations. This was not one flood, but 10,000 floods. Torrential rains from a shifting atmosphere, glacial rivers swelling to continental proportions, ice dams collapsing with earth-shattering force, and the silent, inexorable creep of the oceans reclaiming the land. Every human community, from those living on the newly exposed plains of Doggerland to those in the path of the Missoula floods or the Andean Huaycos would have experienced this age of water as a time of profound instability and terror. The shared dream, then, would not be a memory of one event, but a collective scar from an epoch when the world was literally drowning from the meltwaters of its own icy past. The flood myth was the birth narrative of the current geological age, the Holocene, told from the perspective of a species that witnessed its violent dawn. Ilara turned from the map and sat at her desk, the coloured pins a silent audience at her back. She realised with a calm certainty that the quest for a single provable truth might be missing the point. The scientific theories were not mutually exclusive, they were layers in a palimpsest of memory. A comet-induced climate shock could have triggered accelerated melting. The Black Sea flood could have been a dramatic regional example of the global sea level rise. The universal experience of the Great Melt provided the fertile ground upon which any specific, catastrophic local flood could grow into a cosmic story. The truth, she felt, might be less important than the shared dream itself. The fact that humanity, in its scattered tribes and isolated civilizations, returned again and again to this particular story of waters rising, of a world cleansed or erased, of a fragile vessel of survival, was the real revelation. It was a testament not to a shared historical event, but to a shared psychological and existential condition. The dream revealed humanity's universal vulnerability before the forces of nature, a species born on a planet where the line between life-giving river and life-destroying deluge is perilously thin. But more importantly, it revealed a universal resilience. The story never ended with the drowning, it always ended with the ark grounding, the waters receding, the rainbow appearing, the cave opening, the new land emerging. It was a narrative of hope, engineered against despair. The flood myth, in all its variations, was humanity's way of looking into the abyss of its own fragility and telling itself a story of continuity. Whether the waters were a punishment, a cleansing, a creative force, or a simple, brutal fact of geology, the human response was to imagine a way through them, to save the seeds, to build the boat, to climb the mountain, to heed the warning, to master the channel. The shared dream was, therefore, a foundational act of hope. It was the species convincing itself that even when the world is washed away, something essential, a pair of animals, a brother and sister, a bag of seeds, a body of knowledge, can be preserved to begin again. The quiet in the study deepened. The map with its constellation of pins was no longer a record of a mystery, but a portrait of a family trait. The flood paradox was not a problem to be solved, but a mirror held up to humankind. In it, Elara saw reflected not one origin, but a common heartbeat of fear and a common breath of hope. The waters that threatened to erase also compelled the act of remembering. The dream of the deluge was, in the end, a dream of survival, dreamed separately yet identically across the globe, a powerful, enduring testament to the vulnerability and resilience woven into the very fabric of the human spirit. The truth was in the dreaming. Asterisk. Chapter 11. The river's memory. Asterisk. The river of her childhood had not changed. It was wider now, or perhaps she was smaller in memory, but its essential character remained, a brown-green ribbon, moving with a patient, muscular grace between banks of willow and oak. Dr. Elara Vance stood on the same worn, sandy spit where she had once skipped stones and caught crayfish, the afternoon sun dappling the water through a canopy of late summer leaves. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying vegetation, a scent that bypassed intellect and spoke directly to some deep cellular recognition. She had travelled across continents, through archives and ruins, into mountains and deserts, chasing the echo of a story written in water. Now, she had returned to the source of her own curiosity, to the first river, to listen to what the journey had whispered. Her mind was not a ledger of facts, but a confluence. The images flowed together like tributaries joining a main channel. The tactile grit of the Shuruppak clay, the rain-veiled mound of Çatalhöyük, the rainbow's arc in the monastic silence, the Andean elder's voice sculpting the air, the melancholy of sunken lands, the stark pattern of pins on a map. She did not force them into a single narrative. Instead, she let them mingle, observing the patterns they formed as they swirled together. The flood paradox, which had once been a gentle intellectual puzzle in the archives, had transformed. It was no longer a puzzle at all. A puzzle implied a solution, a correct arrangement of pieces that would yield a clear picture. What she held now was not a picture, but a mirror, a reflecting surface that showed a different face depending on the angle of the light. Whether the stories sprang from one cataclysmic event, a comet's fury, the Black Sea's violent birth, or from the 1,000 local traumas of melting ice and rising seas, the result was the same, a deep species-level memory of water as the alpha and the omega. Water was the first chaos, the new, from which form emerged. It was the life-giver, the Nile's annual gift. It was the destroyer, the terrifying, churning force that could erase cities and continents. It was the cleanser, washing away wickedness. It was the teacher, demanding mastery through toil like ewes. It was the preserver, carrying the ark to a new beginning. It was the mourner, swallowing lands and leaving only ghostly bells. In every story, water was both the source and the end of all things, the medium of transformation, the ultimate power against which human life was a brief, brave eddy. This was not a conclusion one announced. It was a recognition one felt in the bones, like the hum of a tuning fork struck long ago. The stories did not reveal a historical truth, but a psychological and spiritual one. They revealed humanity's profound, ambivalent kinship with the element that constituted its own body and shaped its destiny. The flood myth was the recurring dream of that kinship turning fatal, and then, miraculously, generative. It was the dream of the womb becoming the tomb, and the tomb cracking open to reveal a womb once more. Elara knelt on the cool sand, the river's soft murmur filling her ears. She had brought no grand offering, no scholarly treatise. From her pocket, She withdrew a small, smooth stone she had picked up on the trail from the Andean site, a piece of dark, water-worn basalt. In her other hand, she held a dried seed pod from a sycamore tree that grew by the monastery gate. One was stone, memory solidified, evidence of time's slow flow. The other was potential, a life paused, waiting for the right conditions to unfold. Together they felt like the two halves of the story, the enduring record and the fragile possibility. She did not pray, she simply held the objects in her cupped palms, feeling their contrasting weights and textures, and acknowledged the mystery. She acknowledged the uncanny chorus of voices across millennia, all singing of the same drowning. She acknowledged the scientists digging in mud and ice, seeking the trigger. She acknowledged the elders and the scribes, the poets and the priests, who had shaped the terror into tale. She acknowledged the river before her, this specific familiar river, as one tiny manifestation of the universal power they all described. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she leaned forward and placed the stone and the seed pod onto the surface of the water. They rested there for a moment, a tiny floating island. The current caught them. The seed pod turned slowly, a little boat, and the stone, just barely buoyant, drifted beside it. They began their journey downstream, away from her, carried by the same force that had carved the valley. She watched until they rounded a gentle bend and disappeared from sight, swallowed into the green, dappled light. It was a personal ritual, meaningless to anyone else, but for Ilara, it was an act of release. She was not offering an answer to the river, she was offering her need for one. She was returning the mystery to its source. The stone would sink, eventually, joining the riverbed's memory. The seed pod might catch on a bank somewhere, and perhaps, given water and soil, it would sprout, or it might travel all the way to the sea. The outcome was not hers to control. A profound, peaceful wonder settled over her, as gentle and pervasive as the humidity rising from the water. It was an open-ended feeling, a contentment with the question itself. The flood paradox would never be solved, and that was its beauty. Its power lay in its persistence, in its refusal to be pinned down to a single time or place or cause. It was a story that bound humanity together, not through a shared past, but through a shared dream, a dream of fragility, of catastrophe, and of the stubborn, incredible will to carry something, anything, through the drowning to the other side. She stood, brushing the sand from her knees. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal, its surface a shifting mirror of sky and leaf. It remembered nothing, and it remembered everything. It had seen civilizations rise and fall, stories born and forgotten, and it would see countless more. Ilara turned from the bank, carrying with her not a solution, but a deepened relationship with the mystery. The journey was over, but the listening had just begun. The river's memory was not in its waters, but in the stories they inspired, and in the quiet, wondering hearts of those who walked its banks, heard its murmur, and recognized, with a shiver of kinship, the ancient universal song of the flood. Asterisk. Chapter 12. Echoes in Clay and Stars. Part 1. Asterisk. The studio was a cave of earth and intention, its air thick with the scent of damp clay and wood smoke from a small, pot-bellied stove. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light that fell through a high, north-facing window, illuminating a constellation of works in progress. Slumped forms on shelves, bisque-fired pots awaiting glaze, and the central humming heart of the space, the potter's wheel. Ilara Vance had come to the end of her pilgrimage, not at a library or a dig site, but here, in this quiet sanctuary of making, to visit an artist named Leo, who dug his own clay from the banks of the local river. Leo was a man of few words, his language expressed through the quiet concentration of his hands. He greeted her with a nod, his forearms dusted with a fine grey powder. He was preparing a fresh batch of clay, wedging a hefty lump on a plaster bat with a rhythmic folding pressure that reminded Ilara of kneading bread, or of a heart beating. The clay was not a pristine, bagged commodity. It was raw and local, dug from a deposit where the river had laid it down centuries before. It contained its own history, flecks of mica, tiny granules of sand, the faint iron blush that would fire to a warm terracotta. This was not a neutral medium, it was the river's own flesh, harvested, purified by settling and sieving, but still essentially of this place. With a final, satisfying thump, Leo centered the wedged clay on the wheelhead. He sat, dipped his hands in a bowl of milky slip water, and touched the spinning mound. It was a moment of alchemy. Under the steady pressure of his palms, the chaotic lump yielded, finding its axis, becoming a perfect humming cylinder of potential. Ilara watched, mesmerized, as his thumbs pressed into the center, opening a dark vertical well. The walls began to rise, thin and graceful, guided from within and without, a dialogue between the centrifugal force of the wheel and the centripetal intention of the maker. Water was the essential partner, the lubricant that allowed the transformation, his hands constantly dipping back into the bowl to keep the clay supple, to prevent the friction of creation from tearing the form apart. As the vessel grew, a simple, elegant jar with a gentle belly and a slightly flared lip, Ilara's mind began its own quiet shaping. She saw in the spinning clay a profound metaphor for human civilization itself. Civilization, like this pot, was something formed from the raw earth of a specific place. It was shaped by water, by the life-giving and destructive rivers, by the rains that nourished or drowned, by the seas that connected and submerged. The potter's hands were the collective will, the traditions, the beliefs, the laws that tried to give form and purpose to the chaotic, fertile mud of human community. And like the pot, the result was inherently fragile, a flaw in the making, a hidden air pocket, an imbalance in the firing, and it could crack, shatter, or collapse. History was a midden of such fragments. Yet those fragments were how we knew anything at all. The shard of a Sumerian tablet, the broken base of a Mycenaean stirrup jar, the charred rim of a cooking pot from Çatalhöyük. These were the preserved pieces of the vessel. They were not the whole, but they hinted at the shape of the whole. Archaeologists were the ultimate potters, patiently reconstructing the form from the broken pieces, inferring the missing curves from the arc of a single fragment. Human memory itself was like that, a collection of sherds, stories passed down, often broken, worn smooth at the edges by retelling, but holding the imprint of the original shape. The flood myths were some of the largest, most widely distributed sherds in the midden of global memory, their curves so similar that they suggested a common, original vessel of experience. Leo's hands slowed, and with a fine wire, he severed the finished pot from the wheelhead, lifting it with a tender care onto a board. It was damp, vulnerable, holding the memory of the spin in its perfect symmetry. It would now undergo the trials of drying and firing, where the water that gave it birth would be driven out by fire, transforming its plasticity into permanent ceramic strength. But even then, it would be brittle. Ilara's gaze drifted from the new pot to a shelf of completed works. One, a tall, slender amphora, caught her eye. Its form was elemental, a rounded body, a narrow neck, two graceful handles. It was a container, designed to hold something: water, wine, oil, grain. The connection struck her with the force of a silent bell. The vessel on the potter's wheel was an ark. Every ark in every story, the coracle of Ziusudra, the cube of Utnapishtim, the gopherwood ship of Noah, the sealed cave in the Andes, even the metaphorical boat of the Nile's Blackland was a container. Its sole purpose was to preserve something essential against the annihilating waters. It was a hollow form, a crafted void, whose value lay not in its structure but in its capacity to carry life, memory, and the seeds of continuity from one world to the next. The potter's jar was a miniature ark, designed to carry sustenance. The mythic ark was a colossal jar, designed to carry a world in miniature. The act of pottery, then, was a tiny daily rehearsal of the great myth. The potter took the river's clay, the very substance that could become lethal mud in a flood, and with water and skill, shaped it into a vessel that could withstand fire and hold precious contents. He transformed the agent of chaos into a tool of preservation. In that transformation, Ilara saw the entire human project. We take the raw, terrifying forces of nature, the water, the fire, the earth itself, and through story, through technology, through culture, we attempt to shape them into vessels that can carry us forward. Our civilizations, our laws, our myths, are all pots thrown on the wheel of time, fragile and beautiful, always in danger of collapsing back into the mud from which they came, yet sometimes surviving as fragments that tell a tale. Leo began to clean his tools, the quiet ritual of the studio resuming. The new pot sat on its board, slowly losing the sheen of water, beginning its journey toward permanence. Ilara felt a deep, settling peace. She had spent so long examining the fragments. Now she had watched the vessel being born. The paradox was present here. In this simple act of creation, the clay was local, the technique personal, the form a product of Leo's individual vision. Yet the act itself, the wheel, the water, the shaping of a container, was as universal as the flood story. It was another shared human dream, another echo. The ark was not just a boat, it was any vessel made to carry memory across the drowning waters of time. And in this quiet studio, as another pot was set aside to dry, Ilara understood that the making of such vessels, whether from words or clay, was perhaps the most human act of all. Asterisk. Chapter 12. Echoes in Clay and Stars, Part 2. Asterisk. The night was a vast black bowl, its rim the jagged silhouette of distant hills, its interior dusted with the cold, sharp glitter of a billion stars. A small group had gathered on the gentle slope behind Leo's studio, a handful of his students, a local botanist, a retired teacher, and a few curious neighbours drawn by word of the visiting historian. They sat on wool blankets and folding chairs, wrapped in coats and scarves, their breath making pale ghosts in the air. A single lantern, its flame shielded by glass, cast a small warm pool of light on the grass. But it was the sky that commanded attention, a majestic, silent spectacle that reduced conversation to whispers. Ilara Vance stood at the edge of the lantern's glow, not as a lecturer behind a podium, but as one more witness to the immensity above. She felt no need to present a thesis or defend a theory. The journey was complete, the stories had been gathered. Now, in this informal circle under the stars, she offered only a reflection, a gentle weaving together of threads, a final murmur to the echoing question. She began not with answers, but with the beauty of the question itself. She spoke of the archives, of the quiet shock of seeing the same story emerge from clay tablets and vellum pages separated by continents and millennia. She described the rain on the Anatolian mound, the feel of the primordial silt, and the local researcher pointing to the catastrophic mud layer, a single violent event fossilized in the earth. She recounted the Andean elder's voice in the dark hut, telling of the mountain's cave, and the geologist's trowel tapping the chaotic band in the cliff face, the physical proof of an ancient overturning. She mentioned the predictable gift of the Nile, the relentless toil of Great Yew, the melancholy of sunken lands remembered in Welsh ballads and Tamil laments. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, meant for the intimate scale of the circle and the colossal scale of the night. She did not construct an argument. Instead, she painted a constellation of moments, each a point of light in the long human conversation with water. She spoke of the arcs and the mountains, the rainbows and the covenants, the caves and the mastered channels. She presented them not as conflicting versions of a historical truth, but as variations on a profound recurring dream. The shared flood memory, she suggested, was part of humanity's inheritance, as fundamental as the genetic code that craves salt or fears the dark. It is a story told in the medium of clay and stars. The clay is our earthly, tangible experience, the mud of the riverbank, the silt of the field, the pottery shard that outlives the potter, the tablet that preserves a whisper from Shuruppak. It is the stuff of our bodies and our artifacts, fragile and grounded. The stars are our reach for meaning, for pattern, for connection across the void, the cosmic scale of the catastrophe, the divine actors, the promise written in the heavens, the ancestors' eyes watching from the dark. Every flood myth is a braid of these two strands, the earthly trauma of water reshaping the land, and the celestial story we spin to make sense of that trauma. This inherited story, she continued, binds us across time and space, not because we all survived the same flood, but because we all share the same condition. We are creatures of a water planet, living in the tense, fertile margin between the river that nourishes and the river that drowns. The story is a lullaby of survival. Its function is not to terrify, but to soothe the deepest anxiety, the fear of absolute erasure. It assures us across generations that even when the world seems to end, something is saved. A seed, a story, a pair of animals, a brother and sister. The narrative itself is the ark, carrying the assurance of continuity through the drowning waters of time and forgetting. It is a lullaby because it allows us to contemplate the unthinkable, total loss, and then to rest in the knowledge that the human thread, however thin, has never been completely severed. We are here, listening under these stars, because countless ancestors told a version of this tale and believed in the possibility of the morning after the deluge. A satellite traced a slow, deliberate arc across the Milky Way, a tiny moving point of human ingenuity amid the ancient fixed fires. Allura fell silent, letting the night sounds fill the space. The rustle of dry grass in a faint breeze, the distant call of an owl. The members of the small group sat quietly, some looking at the stars, some at the dim shapes of the hills, all held in the serene unity of the moment. There were no questions. The presentation had not invited debate. It had offered a perspective, a way of seeing the old stories not as problems, but as gifts. The shared dream, Allura concluded inwardly, gazing at the star-strewn sky, was the real mystery and the real treasure. The scientific search for a source, a comet, a bursting ice dam, a rising sea, was noble and illuminating, but it could never capture the full resonance of the dream. The dream was older than history, deeper than geology. It was the sound of the species talking to itself about its own fragility and its own stubborn hope. In every culture, the storytellers took the terrifying memory of real water rising and transformed it into a vessel of meaning. They gave us arcs to build, mountains to climb, rainbows to trust, and caves to shelter in. They gave us a way to carry on. The lantern flame guttered slightly, then steadied. One by one, the group began to stir, rising with soft murmurs of thanks, their faces pale in the starlight. They drifted away down the hill toward the warm lights of the houses below, leaving Allura and Leo standing together in the quiet dark. He looked up at the sky, then at the dark shape of his studio, where the pots he had made from river clay sat in silent rows. "A good night for echoes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Allura nodded, a smile touching her lips. Above them, the stars shone, indifferent and eternal. Below them, the unseen river murmured its endless journey to the sea. Between them, held in the brief human span, was the story told in clay, written in stars, whispered on the wind, a lullaby of survival, a testament to a dream shared by all humanity, a serene and unifying echo in the vast, beautiful dark.